Hello and welcome to my FlossTube channel. I'm Jean Farish and I'm so glad that you're here with me today and that I get to spend this time with you. So this is September and there is a hashtag going around of Sampler September, and people are posting on Facebook and Instagram and I guess other social media places as well with samplers that they're working on. So I wanted to start today with a little one that I'm going to be teaching at Work of the Hands. This is Gracious Words. It's a quote from Proverbs. Gracious words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. And for this class, it is a taste of stump work. Stump work is also known as raised embroidery, and it is simply the use of three-dimensional techniques to bring a different texture and dimension to our otherwise flat embroidery. And in this piece, I'm using two types of stump work. In the bees skep and the little table that it's sitting on, actually there's three techniques, so that's two. And then the third one are the little bees. Oops, just caught something. And in this case, the bees' bodies are made with beads. And then the wings are using a detached, basically a picot technique to make each one of the little wings. And so it's kind of hard to photograph, but I think you can see that they are raised. Now, one of the big challenges I had with this piece, as one who stitches 99.9% of the time without a hoop or frame of any sort, was that with doing this type of a raised embroidery, oftentimes you need both hands busy with doing the embroidery. And so not only do you need a hoop or frame of some sort, but it needs to be on some type of a stand so that both hands are free. So that was one of the challenges for me as a needle worker. And the other challenge for me is that as those of you who watch me every week know, I wash and iron every piece of counter cross stitch that I do. And I knew that once I did the raised parts of this, that washing and ironing was going to be a challenge. So that meant that I had to be particularly careful. Now, I did wash and iron it once this part was done, and because when I iron it, I put my needlework face down on a stack of terry towels, I knew that this wasn't going to get squished. I made sure, I think that day I may have even had like 6 layers of terry towels. But once I knew that I did the metallic with the bees, for the bees, that ironing this area would not be a good idea. So before I started the bees, I made sure everything was pristine, and then I put it in a really large embroidery hoop, like a 10-inch. And so the only parts that were anywhere near the embroidery hoop were the outer corners. And I will that first of all, let me say that worked. Okay, so I was able to keep the work clean and wrinkle-free by doing that. I knew that hoop marks are a real challenge for a lot of people. And I do try to respect what anybody is going through, even though I'm not the one going through it. The old thing about walking a mile in my shoes, though, is very, very real. And in this case, I discovered that even though my piece was only in the embroidery hoop for maybe 6 hours, I had a real challenge getting those hoop marks out. I really had to saturate the piece, and what I did was I put a cloth over this area so that when I spritzed it, that part wasn't getting wet at all. And I had to iron it 3 times. The third time, I really soaked the fabric. So the takeaway from this is, if you're going to be using an embroidery hoop or frame of any type, you need to be dedicated to taking that needlework out of the hoop every time you finish for the day. I have the sense that from what people say and what I read on social media, that people very often leave their work in an embroidery hoop for days, if not even weeks. And that is just not a good idea. That is when you are going to experience embedded dirt, which is really hard to get out. I don't care how careful you are. Our skin has natural oils in it, and there are environmental things going on all the time that you might not even be aware of that's going to land on your work. But the hoop marks are probably a bigger concern. And when I think of how hard it was for me to get the hoop marks out of this piece when it had only been in the hoop for like 6 hours, I just don't know how anybody does it when it's for longer periods of time. So I really hope that those of you who use a hoop will modify your habits, if you're not already taking it out on a daily basis, that you start doing that. The fabric needs to relax. It needs to get back to its natural shape. And when you think about what it's doing to your embroidery, you're basically really pressing those wrinkles in. So anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. And while we're talking about samplers, which kind of, when am I ever not talking about samplers? I have a class I'm going to be teaching up at Hobby House Needleworks in April of next year, 2022, that I am really excited about. This is something I've wanted to teach for a long time. In fact, I haven't taught this like since the 80s. So I'm really, really excited about this opportunity. And that is to design your own Schoolgirl Sampler. And by working with Kathy up at Hobby House Needleworks, the students will be able to choose their own fabric and their own threads, not just color, but also type, as far as which type of linen they want to work on, whether they want to work with cotton or silk or whatever. Hobby House Needleworks has an incredible inventory, and so I really think everybody will find exactly what their heart desires within the shop. And we'll be using a lot of different inspirations and sources for creating our own sampler. And of course, beyond that, students are encouraged to bring anything with them that are little bits and pieces or inspiration, whatever, of things they have always wanted to put into a sampler. And then this way, each person's going to have their own unique design when we're all finished. So that's going to be taking place. Let me check those dates here for a second. It's April, I should know these dates. April 9th and 10th. It's one class that's split over 2 days. That way we don't get totally overwhelmed with all the information that's going to be buzzing about. So it's the afternoon of those 2 dates, April 9th and 10th. And like I say, it's you're not choosing one day or the other. You're going to be in class both of those days. So anyway, so the way to get more information, details about pricing, whatever, and to register is to go to the Hobby House Needleworks website and register. You're not going to register through me. You need to register through the shop. But I'm hoping to see you there. So that's going to be really exciting. The other day, I saw a post on one of the many Facebook groups that I belong to that are needlework focused. And the person was asking for help. She was struggling with figuring out how big to cut a piece of fabric because she was trying to convert it from metric to what is actually called the imperial system. We Americans don't think about what our measurement system is called, but I'm here to educate you, to tell you that it's technically the imperial system. In just a minute, I'll get into a little bit of the history of that. those of you who have known me for a long time know that I used to teach history, and so I've always got that connection of trying to figure out, where does this come from? Why do we believe what we believe? Why do we do what we do? So the first thing I want to point out to you is that here in the US, any standard ruler that you pick up has what we think of as, our system, the normal system. And then on the other side is the metric system. And I think most of us are aware of that. Again, this is the imperial system. This is the metric system. And interestingly enough, there are only 3 countries in the world that still use the imperial system: the US, Liberia, and Myanmar. So I think it's kind of interesting that when we talk about needlework, we talk about stitches per inch, inches being the key word here. When we talk about the count of linen, we talk about the number of threads per inch. When we're talking about Aida cloth, we're talking about the number of squares per inch. So the whole thing is wrapped up in the imperial system. And yet, there's only 3 countries in the world that use that system. So what I want to say to my friends that live outside the US and outside Liberia and Myanmar is, instead of trying to convert from one system to the other, grab a ruler that has both systems on it and do your measuring from the imperial side, and don't even think about the metric side. In a way, it's the reverse of what our scientists have to do. They don't convert from imperial to metric. And the scientific community, of course, uses the metric system all the time, and they just use it. You use one system or the other. There's really, other than, I don't even know if they still teach this in elementary school, but I remember we did all kinds of conversions. But I think for needlework, it's best just to think in terms of the imperial system. So here's a little bit of the history lesson. So why are we using the imperial system when the rest of the world is not? And what I found really fascinating was it goes back to the French Revolution. And after the French Revolution, they just wanted to just do a lot of changes, not just socially, but the scientific community said, you know what, our measurement system is just chaos, and what we need is something that's standardized. And so bunch of, scientific, brilliant minds of the day got together and determined it actually goes back to the circumference of the earth, which I found interesting. Anyway, I'm not going to get into too much more detail about this. If you're interested, there are lots of resources that you can check into. So the metric system was born, and the scientific community really lobbied for everyone in the world to be using the same system. So not only was it standardized within the country of France, but just standardized so that when a scientist was talking about a certain measurement, no matter where they were in the world, then it was understood what was meant by that. So why do we Americans use this antiquated system? And it goes back in a way to, it's kind of interesting, it's to our own revolution. So prior to the American Revolution, of course, we were ruled by Britain and used the British system, which became our system. And then after the French Revolution and the beginning of the metric system, then the people of the UK decided to switch to the metric system. And here we are across the pond, and stubborn Yanks that we are said, no thanks, we're sticking with the system that we have. So that's why we still use the system that we've got. So I think most Americans think that, that huge parts of the world use our system, and that just isn't true. Anyway, so in terms of needlework, though, sorry world, you're stuck with the imperial system and stitches per inch and threads per inch. And so rather than trying to convert it, just get yourself a ruler that's got both systems on it and use one or the other. So that's my tip for the day. In today's snippet, as part of my ongoing beginner cross-stitch primer, I'm going to show you how to securely begin and end your threads. And I'm going to emphasize two methods for starting, and that's the loop method and the waist knot. And really, I'm only going to show you one way to end your threads because it's actually pretty universal. I'm going to start with the loop method, which is using a single strand of floss to actually be stitching with two strands. So I'm going to fold this in half and bring my two cut ends together, and I'm going to thread those into the eye of my needle. I think that one of the things that's confusing to beginners is when we talk about how many strands we're stitching with. And I think what helps is think in terms of the number of strands that are threaded into the eye of your needle. So it doesn't matter that I started with a single piece of thread. I have two strands now threaded into the eye of my needle. So therefore I'm stitching with two strands. Now on the other end of this, because I folded it in half, I have a loop. And what we're going to do is we're going to start our first stitch wherever the pattern tells you to start and with whatever color, and make our first half cross. And on the back, I've not pulled my thread all the way through. I still have the loop. So I'm going to execute that first half cross, and on the back, as I pull this through, while I still have my loop, I'm putting my threaded needle through the loop, and now I'm going to pull this down tight, pull the rest of the excess through, and that's my loop start. And now back here on the front, I'm going to stitch my row. Now I'm going to use this row to also show you how to end a thread. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch a half dozen or so stitches here. But let's take a look on the back again. So there's my loop, and now I've got the beginning of my stitches. So this, by the way, is the Danish method, when you're stitching a half cross over and then a half cross back. Now as I end my last cross stitch here, making it into a full cross, let's take a look at the back. So again, this is where I began my stitching, and then I have all these little upright stitches. And again, this is what it's going to look like when you're stitching the Danish method. So while we're here on the back, how can I secure this thread effectively? And what I'm going to do is simply slide my needle under 4 or 5 existing stitches on the back, just like that, and pull it through. Now you'll hear people will say you can go under just 2 or 3. If that's all you have to go under, I would actually go under the 2 or 3 and make a U-turn and go back the other way. I like stitching sliding my needle under 4 or 5 stitches like this. That allows me to cut this off right at the base of this thread. I don't leave an extra 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 inch or whatever, which a lot of people do, and I hear them say it's because they want to make sure their stitches don't come undone. But if you've gone under 4 or 5 stitches on the back, it's not going to come undone. So what I recommend that you do is just cut this off right at the base. And you don't have to be afraid that you're going to cut the wrong thing. If you can see both points of your scissors, you're not going to cut the wrong thing. So I can slide my scissors right to the base of this and snip it, and I know that this is not going to come undone. So that's showing you both the beginning and the ending way to secure a thread using the loop method. It's important to note that that loop method works when you are going to be stitching with an even number of strands, 2, 4, 6, or you're stitching with a solid color. When you are stitching with a single strand or with a variegated or hand-painted or hand-dyed thread, then the loop method is not recommended. Instead, what you want to use is a waist knot. And using a waist knot, again, now I'm going to be threading the eye of my needle with 2 strands. And as I said before, when you talk about how many strands you're stitching with, regardless of how many you start with, it's how many are threaded through the eye of the needle. So in this case, stitching with 2. So what I want to do at the other end of my thread is to put a knot. This is going to be cut away, which is why we call it a waist knot. It's going to be waisted. It doesn't have to be a particularly pretty knot. You can just use just an overhand knot or just something that's going to basically create an anchor. And this waist knot is going to go on the front of our fabric. So in this case, I'm going to stitch across here. So I want to put my waist knot away from where I'm going to be stitching on the front of my fabric. So there is my waist knot, and I'm going to start stitching over here. So you want your waist knot across from where you're going to be stitching. And again, I'm demonstrating with using the Danish method, and so I am doing a half crossover, and we'll be crossing them back and making a full cross on the journey coming back in the other direction. So let's take a look at the back here. Again, here's my waist knot. So my waist knot is over here. And so as I am stitching, I am securing that thread on the front. So I'm stitching backwards here for a moment just to demonstrate. So I'm catching this thread with my stitches on the front. Now, it's frankly kind of easy to miss, so don't just go merrily stitching across. Do check every once in a while and make sure that you are catching that thread on the back. Now, again, to me, the magic number is 4 or 5 stitches. When I am at the point where I have caught that thread on the back with 4 or 5 of my stitches, then I will feel like that it is secure. And when it is, I'm going to bring my needle to the front of my fabric. I'm just going to park my needle right here for a moment. Turn this over, and again, you can see where I have secured that thread on the back. So at this point, I can slip my scissors under that thread and cut. And take my waist knot away. Now, notice that there's still a gap here. You don't want to judge this so closely that you won't have room, as I did, to slide my scissors underneath that on the back. And now we just take that away so it's waisted. Now you may notice that on the back, that beginning looks just like my ending here. And that would be a very good observation. You'd be absolutely right. If I were to end at this point and cross my stitches back, I would end up back over here. And to secure the end of it, I'd be going under the exact same stitches, which is not an impossible thing to do. And every once in a while, that is what you need to do. But that's why so many people like the loop method. We refer to it as being a way of having a neater back. And I feel pretty strongly about this whole thing about striving for a neat back. For me, the goal is not to have a neat back. The goal is to have pretty stitches on the front and to stitch effectively and just to have pretty stitches. And in doing that, you will end up with a neat back as a byproduct. It isn't, to me, it isn't the goal. It's the advantage of stitching well and effectively on the front. The evidence will be shown on the back. As I'm coming close to the end of this new row, a couple things to point out. One is that you don't have to bury your threads under the stitches that you just completed. If there is a row that's completed above or below where you're stitching, it's perfectly okay to what I call tunnel under, or slip your threaded needle under existing stitches that are nearby. So it does not have to be the exact same color or the exact same row you were just working on. But in this case, I've got a gap between these two rows, so that's what I'm going to have to do. So as I finish that, again, back here, I'm basically where I began before. So I'm going to slip my threaded needle under the same stitches. I don't really have a choice. And so again, I'm pulling that all the way through. And because I know it's secure, I can effectively cut this off right at the end of it. You know, actually there is a third way that I can show you to anchor your threads at the beginning of a stitch that's nice and secure. And that is, let's just call it a knotless waist knot. So let's say if right under this row of stitches that I have done, I'm going to be stitching with the green. So I have these existing stitches done. I can start my next row with a waist knot, but what if I just go under, again, let's assume that I need to be stitching right here, okay? That's where my next stitch is going to go. So on the back here, why not just slip my needle under these stitches, which will let me come out right near where I need to be to make my next stitch. Now you do need to make sure that as you're pulling this, you're not pulling it so hard that you yank those stitches out. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say stitches, yank that thread out. But once you get going, then it's nice and anchored and you're good to go. Now let's come back, let's look at the back again. So I've secured my thread under these existing stitches with a knotless waist knot and started stitching. But what about this tail right here? What should I do about that? Now, as I said before, I'm going to go ahead and snip that off right close. I left a little bit extra just so that I, wouldn't pull it through all the way. But I don't want to leave any extra on the back. Those extra tails are the ones that end up getting pulled through to the front and will it just causes knots and chaos, whatever, on the back. And you'll be glad in the end that you had a nice, neat back, especially if it ever happens that you have to rip something out. And again, the advantage of the loop method is that you have half as many places that you've got tails going under existing stitches, which gives you more places to end threads without having to double up like I just did in the example that I showed you. So that gives you two ways to securely start your threads with, well, actually three, the loop method, the waist knot, and the knotless waist knot, and one way to end them securely, and that is to slip that threaded needle under 4 or 5 existing stitches on the back and cutting that thread right off what I call dangerously close. So I hope this helps you as you are starting your journey and enjoying the craft of counter cross stitch. There are days that I think I spend too much time on social media. And then I remind myself it's my way of connecting with people around the world. And I'd like to think every once in a while I can help a person who's struggling with one of the many concepts of counter cross stitch. But I also at times unearth kind of unsettling trends. And one of them that's coming up more and more often are people who are complaining, that's really the best word, and legitimately complaining about charts they get, and when they receive them, they discover that they have no grid lines. Now, I cannot imagine doing a counter cross stitch project from a chart that has symbols and no grid lines. As someone who designs and teaches needlework, I'm appalled. And I think that you as consumers should be too. And I think that if you buy a chart and when you get it, discover it has no grid lines, you need to complain. There needs to be standards. There needs to be things that consumers need and they deserve to know that they're getting when they buy a chart. And apparently that is just not happening. Perhaps it's the international nature of the business now. But I think what really bothers me is when somebody makes a post like this. Inevitably, somebody will say, well, when I get a chart like that, I just go back and draw in the grid lines. And I'm like, what? I don't even know where to go with that. I don't care if it's a small design that's 45 by 45 stitches, much less one that's 100 by 100 or 100 by 200. It's not your job as a consumer to add something as standard as grid lines to a chart. I don't know what software these people are using. The type of software I have, when I produce a PDF file, I have a choice of either adding grid lines or not. I would never do that to my customers. I would never send you a chart that has no grid lines. And I don't think that you should put up with it. There are too many good designs out there for you to choose from, for you to have to struggle with a design. Choose something else, but make sure that you let that designer know that it's unacceptable. So that's just a little bit of, I don't know, advice, wisdom. Yeah, there's just no reason for it. So that's, again, one woman's opinion, one woman's very, very strong opinion. So that's, okay. Stop rambling, Jean. Just go on to the next subject. And lastly, a comment left by Nancy really brought back some wonderful memories for me. She said, I love, love, love the Facebook group Stitching Road Trip, which I've mentioned a couple of times, of how that Facebook group is all about sharing where the wonderful local needleworks stores are, where the best of the counter cross stitch and needlepoint stores are really around the world. It's a great Facebook group, and if you don't already know about it, you need to be joining it. But at any rate, let me get back to what Nancy said. She said, it reminds me of a book that I believe you wrote or edited that did the same thing on an annual basis. I can't remember the name of the book, and who knows where it might be in my stash, but I bought it every year, and I used it whenever I went on a trip. I really missed the book when it was no longer being published. Now, when I might get back on the road again, Stitching Road Trip will help me find my way to some great shops. Okay, Nancy, yes, this was it. And I think I only published it 3 times. This was right on the cusp of when people started having home computers. And it was, I'm also thinking about this one because this was a very long title. Let me focus here. The Cross-Stitch Lover's Guidebook to Cross-Stitch Shops in America. I mean, if that isn't a grandiose title, I don't know what is. And as you see, this was, I used the America Land That We Love charts. And so in the Pennsylvania listing, there's Pennsylvania's chart. And in the Texas listing, I mean, so this was, I had maps of, okay, so like here's Ohio, which has some great shops. So there was a map that showed where the shops were located. There were ads from some of the shops. And so, yeah, this was a ambitious project at the time, and a fun way of getting people connected to where great shops were, so that when they traveled for business or pleasure, they could always find a good needlework shop somewhere nearby. And of course, now with things being computerized, the Facebook group, Stitching Road Trip, is the next best thing. And that is a Facebook group that I founded and was administrator of for a long time. And it really was a modern day version of this book. So, yeah, thanks, Nancy, for bringing me back down memory lane. And I do appreciate that so much. So I hope that you have a great week ahead of you, and that wherever you are, you stitch happy and stay safe. And I'll see you next week.